Turn back to Genesis 41 to continue in our reading there. Genesis chapter 41, and reading on in the chapter now from verse 37 through to the end of the chapter. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such an one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah, gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For God, said he, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim. For God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended. And the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said, and the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt was there bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. Famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all the lands. Amen. As far we read in God's holy and inspired word. Well, the congregation of our Lord Jesus Christ, there are indeed many sufferings and trials in this life as we pass through it. But for the child of God, resting by faith in Christ, there are also, at one and the same time, many wondrous encouragements and blessings. We have been seeing that hitherto in the life of Joseph, haven't we? He suffered, as we have been looking at, some of the most severe forms of affliction and abuse that are known to human beings. And not only that, from his own family, no less. And then following on from his own family, from others. And along with it then came all sorts of temptations, afflictions, false accusations, defamation, and unjust punishment. All of these things poured upon this young man. But With his faith and his trust placed in his Creator and Redeemer, he was actually through those very things. He was actually going through those trials with his faith in his Lord and his God, that his faith flourished and blossomed and brought forth even more fruit. He became stronger in faith and more abundant in generous, kind love and service to others. So what we see there, the beauty of God's grace and the strength of God working in an ordinary, fallible, weak human being, even through those afflictions that have come. We've observed this. God sends the hardships of life to his children, not to bow them down. God was not sending these hardships upon Joseph, as it were, to beat him into the dust, as it were. Not at all. He was sending them so that Joseph may be lifted up and strengthened in God's unfailing grace and truth and mercy. And that's exactly what happened in the life of Joseph. But today, as we continue in this history and enter into Genesis 41, we enter into a completely different phase of Joseph's life, and one that is now very, very different, completely and utterly changed in his circumstances. And therefore the question arises, well, what will happen with Joseph now? Will this significantly alter his life and his outlook? And what is God doing in all of this? Now, somewhat we already know those answers, don't we? Because we know the outcome of the history, but we ought to examine it a little more closely. What's the significance of this for Joseph, for the Old Testament church, and for our life and walk? Let's examine this chapter and therefore our text under the theme, Joseph elevated in Egypt. Under that we'll consider three things. First of all, let's examine more closely the circumstances of all that happens here. Secondly, let's look at the result. What result comes out of what God works here? And finally, let's look at the reason that God is doing all of this. Joseph elevated in Egypt. It's now, as we read at the beginning of the chapter there, it's now at the end of 2 full years since the butler and the baker, the cupbearer and the baker were there in prison. And remember that Joseph had asked the cupbearer when he was restored, please remember me to Pharaoh and all the injustice that I received. But by now, Joseph would have realised, in fact quite some time ago, that the butler had purposely and completely forgotten completely about him. But Joseph continues to serve in the prison faithfully. Another 2 years gone past. He now would have spent many, many years in prison. But Jehovah is working. We ought to know that. Jesus in his ministry said, hitherto my Father works and I work. In other words, God is continuously, powerfully, very actively at work. Though we at times in our life think, well, I'm just stuck. Nothing's happening. It's not true. God's at work. And now comes the perfect and right time for God to send this dream to Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a most striking dream. It's striking, this dream, for two reasons. First of all, because this is a dream sent from God. And we've noted this before. When a dream is sent from God, it is vastly different. Okay? It is qualitatively different from the dreams that we have, where our brains circle through all sorts of things in our mind. These dreams, when someone has one of these dreams, they know, whoa, this is something that has come from God. And they're absolutely sure of it. They know that this is very different. But it's also striking because of the content of this dream. Quite striking in its content. So, what does Pharaoh see? I reckon all the children should be able to tell me this particular dream, because its content is quite remarkable, isn't it? What happens here, children? Pharaoh dreams a dream, and what he sees is a river, and then up out of this river, almost certainly when it says the river, it's referring to the Nile, because that was the river for them. So up out of the river, we know immediately, this is symbolism, isn't it? Okay, cows don't live underwater in the river. Okay, that's not true. Okay, but these cows, they come up out of the river, and now they come up and into the field, and these cows, wow, these cattle, they are the most fat-looking, sleek-looking, marvellous-looking cattle you have ever seen. And there they are feeding on the grass. But next thing, up out of the river following them, 7 of the worst-looking cattle girls. Basically look like leather stretched over bones, you know, sort of like the skulls all sunken in and look like they're just about to fall over dead. Horrible looking things, okay? Pharaoh says, I've never seen anything like that in all the land of Egypt. And these things come up out of the river, and they stand beside these other cattle, and then what do? Once again, we know this is symbolism. You don't have any carnivorous cows, do you? But these thin cattle, they start eating up the big fat cattle, and they eat the whole of them up. 7 eat the other 7, and at the end of it, those cows, they still look horrible, emaciated, thin, skinny, like they haven't eaten a thing. And Pharaoh wakes up. And he's absolutely astounded. He remembers all of this in absolute vivid detail. He realizes that this is an incredible dream, but the Lord causes him to fall asleep again, and he dreams again. And this time it's ears of corn. And we can immediately see the similarities, can't we? 7 cows and 7 ears of corn, and so on, and one eating the other. But this time it's 7 ears of corn. So you've got this stalk of corn, and these great, big, fat, juicy cobs of corn that have grown up on there, and 7 of them all on one stalk. But then, suddenly grows up these shriveled, bent, skinny, hardly any kernels of corn there. Look like they've been withered away, so they've been put in a, sort of a dryer, so that they're crunchy, and that's what comes up. And yet these things gobble up the big, fat, juicy corn cobs until there's nothing left. Once again, you don't have carnivorous corn, do we? So this is very much symbolic. Very, very clear that this is symbolic. And Pharaoh would know that. And he knows that there's a meaning to this. Pharaoh awaits. He knows he's had a dream. He knows that this is symbolic. He knows that there is a very significant meaning to this. And you get the sense that the rest of his night was not very restful at all. So when it comes to first thing in the morning, we read that his spirit was troubled. His spirit was troubled. It means that spirit was troubled. It means, literally, the Hebrew is often very graphic. It means like his soul within him was pummeled and belted around within him. All right, so he's been thrown around in his mind and his heart, and he's greatly disturbed, and he is thrown into turmoil, and he has to know what's the meaning. Well, he's God, people call him. The land of Egypt at that time was one of the great superpowers, if you like, of that day. And therefore they had these men, if you like, the universities, and these men were directly in the employ of Pharaoh. The magicians, who are more the ones that are, under the religious side of things, with all the priests and so forth, as well as the wise men, and they were mighty wise. You only need to look back at the maths of ancient Egypt and the constructions that they had, and their astronomy, and their knowledge of those things, and the physics and the mechanics that they actually used. And this was a highly advanced, very intelligent nation, and these men were the cream of the cream. Pharaoh calls them in and says to them, here's my dream. Here's my dream. Very simple in its pictures. If I ask the children to tell me that story, I'm sure they can do so. It's not like it's hard to remember the details. And yet, these men have no answers. We're not told they're here, whether maybe some of them hazarded a guess or two, but quickly mumbled into silence because it's pretty obvious that it's not the right answer. We don't know, but they have no answer. There is no ability to interpret this dream, this revelation from God. And as soon as you say that, then immediately you realise, don't you? What do we see here? As soon as we see this written, these men were where they were because of their great ability to know many things, to know great facts. Their ability to do great things, and they have already done great things in this kingdom of ancient Egypt. But when it comes to real truth, okay? Truth with a capital T, real truth, the truth of God, reveals into real life. What do these men have? Nothing. Nothing. They have no answers. Here's the Word of God revealed in its clarity, and they have nothing. It's the same for us, brethren. We want to see that this is a teaching that is given to us and applied into our age as well. We have, in our day and age, so many different fields of knowledge, don't we? Men and women that have incredible knowledge and ability and have brought all sorts of things to pass in so many different fields of knowledge. And we ought to recognise that. We sit here in a building and we are enjoying air conditioning, and we've driven here in a car, and we drive on roads and bridges and all sorts of things. These come out of the ability and knowledge of men and women as they are putting those things in practice, and they give real help to us, and we want to acknowledge that. Those things are very true. But when it comes to matters to do truly with the heart and the soul of man, with the revelation and the interpretation of truth, the capital T, truth, that really is the foundation of life and the understanding of who we are and who God is and what we are to believe and how we are to live, such men have nothing. Nothing. That's why, remember I pointed out in the Psalm, these men fall down and worship idols. What does the Word of God give as its definition of those who fall down and worship idols? They are like them. Blind, deaf, dumb. With regards to the true matters of life, how we are to live, how we are to understand God and man, the real realities of life. So it is for the philosophers of our day. So it is for the psychologists of our day. Do you understand? Psychology psych refers to soul. It's the study of the soul. How are those who are dead in their souls can tell you anything about the soul? They fall down and worship all of the idols of Freud and Jung and Adler and you name it, all of those idols. They worship them and they're just like are blind and deaf and dumb. They cannot tell you things. We need the Lord. And we need His truth clearly set forth in His Word and interpreted to us. It's at this point with Joseph and with Pharaoh that the cupbearer, the butler, he remembers Joseph, or more correctly, he remembers his sin of purposely forgetting Joseph because he didn't want to endanger his own position, considering it was fairly tenuous after he'd already upset Pharaoh and didn't want to end up back there, so didn't want to know anything about Joseph. But now he remembers his faults. That not only his faults against Pharaoh, but in here he knows his fault against Joseph as well. And the butler then explains that narrative of events of what had happened when Pharaoh was displeased and he and the baker were thrown into the jail, and each of them had dreams. And they mentioned them to this young man, this Hebrew young man, and that Hebrew young man was able to tell them the exact interpretation of the dream. Not only that, but it came to pass exactly as he had said. Well, it is a real answer, isn't it? So Pharaoh says, well, call for him. Go and get him. Bring him here. Notice Joseph is called. He changes his raiment for a start. That's because if you come into the Pharaoh's court, you need to be dressed appropriately. You can't just wander into the Pharaoh's court in any old way. You certainly can't come in prison garb. And not only that, but he also has to shave. Okay? That doesn't mean that Joseph was lying down there looking pretty scruffy. What it means is that you had to have the appropriate, perfectly shaved face and the pattern of the Egyptians before you could come into the presence of the king. So Joseph had to have the right clothes and be shaved in the right way before he could appear before the face of Pharaoh. This is done hastily, and Joseph is brought in before the king. And of course, before all the wise men and before all the court, before all the pomp and ceremony of the Egyptian court there, Pharaoh speaks to Joseph, and he then starts to set before him, recounting his dream, and requests Joseph that he may interpret, because he says none of the wise men could do this, and he's got his eyes now fixed on Joseph, and he says to him, he has heard that Joseph can understand a dream to interpret it. As soon as that's said, that there in verse 15, can you see that set before Joseph there is like a real possibility of temptation. Pharaoh says, I have heard that you Joseph, can understand a dream to interpret it. What a temptation for Joseph to say, oh yes, that's me. There's an opportunity. Pharaoh's seen something in me. I might get out of this prison finally. Yeah, I'll say to him, yep, that's me. I'm a great guy. You should have me here in the court. Is that the way that Joseph responds? No, not at all. Joseph's immediate response, even before Pharaoh recounts the dream, is to say this: it is not in me. It's not in me. It's not of me. It's nothing that is in me that is able to do any great and wonderful thing. Brethren, is that not what we should confess also? Anything that we have, it's been given to us from God, and it's not in us. He says, God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. God will give the answer, not me. Joseph continues faithful to God. He says the interpretation's got nothing to do with me. It's only God who can show forth his truth. And when he says that God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace, what he means by that is he's not talking about the peace that exists through our justification. We have peace with God, not at all. What he's simply saying is that the answer that comes is, I give you the interpretation from God if you want to have a peace in your heart. Instead of being a troubled soul as he was, all being pummeled around, when he hears this, he will know, yeah, that is the interpretation. That's the truth, as it were. It will settle him knowing that is assuredly the truth. So, Joseph explains. He says this dream has been given in a double form. He says the fact that you've been given this in two different ways, in a double form, God is saying this is absolutely certain. There is no doubt about this. God will bring this to pass very shortly. He says that there will be 7 years of plenteous growing season with an abundance of produce, far more than they would be able to consume, but it will be followed by 7 years of severe famine, which will utterly consume every bit of abundance that they have had before, and it will seem as if there never was an abundance. That's the idea of the 7 skinny cows eating up the 7 fat cows, and they look exactly the same at the end. As it were, it just consumes, the famine consumes every bit of abundance, and there's nothing left. Notice that Joseph refers to just one God, not the multiple gods of the Egyptians, and notice that all of this is under the control of the one living God, not the other gods like the river god, the Nile river god, or the sun god, or anything of the kind. They will be able to do nothing about these things as God surely brings them to pass. But Joseph doesn't stop there. He doesn't simply give the interpretation and finish. He immediately goes on to give very wise counsel. Brethren, this is so. Whenever real truth, with a capital T, whenever real truth is brought forth, it has practical implications. It enters into and must affect the whole way in which we live. Just the same as here. And so it is for us. As we understand the biblical Reformed faith, then it ought not to be just simply, well, I believe this, and this, and this, and then I live my life over here. It's actually because I live all of this, then that affects how I live, and how I think, and how I will do everything in my life. truth, if it's real truth, and it's believed truth, and it comes into the practical way that we live. It's lived out in our life. So Joseph says, Pharaoh, you ought to seek for an honourable and careful and practical man who will, in the years of plenty, save up 20% of what is being produced, because it's more than what they can use. 20% taken away will make no difference to people having abundance. Store it up under the hand of Pharaoh. So it belongs to Pharaoh. Then release it again when the famine comes. And he suggests that there should be many officers. This one man can't do it himself. He'll need to have, as it were, a team of men, many men under him to control them and tell them what they must do so that this can be done. Joseph, you see, in this way shows also his knowledge of wretched human nature. Okay? What do we tend to do? We got plenty, we just live like pigs in mud. There's no thought for the future. It's a bit like at the moment. We actually have a peace and a prosperity in our land. And we have an abundance of being able to grow in the knowledge and the truth of Christ. And yet we tend to just get stuck into all the material things, and we spend very little time soaking up the truth of God's word. And there's a time of persecution that will come eventually. And you will not have access to everything that you have access to at the moment. Are we storing up for the time of famine? What's the result? What's the result from this? Pharaoh, hearing this interpretation, he knows it to be the truth. As it were, his soul has been pummeled around inside of him, and now he knows, I know this to be the truth. How does he know it? What we're to understand is that this is God's work as well. We're told in the scriptures that the heart of a king is in the hand of God, and he turns it whithersoever he will. And so it is here too. This is God who's controlling even evil men, so that Pharaoh is utterly convinced of what is going on here. He knows that it makes no sense, and not only that, but God moves him to see something else that is true as well. That is that this very man who stands before him right now is the most appropriate man to put in the place of overseeing the gathering of his food and then the distribution of it. And he therefore says to all those that are there, and of course you don't disagree with Pharaoh anyway, this man must indeed be one who is set there with this job for the next 14 years to give out this work. Notice that Pharaoh, once again in the providence of God, does not just give Joseph a job, does not just simply say, here you go, here's your job, grand gatherer and collector and then distributor of food, and here's your team of men. He exalts him. He exalts him, in fact, over every other person in the kingdom, over all the wise men and magicians. Probably rankled a bit, wouldn't it, with those men? And here's this guy who's just been dragged out of the prison where he's been sitting, and suddenly, in one day, he's up above and over all of them. He's raised to the very peak of power in Egypt. Remember that Pharaoh was considered a god, and therefore way above everyone else, but now, really, Joseph is the earthly ruler, with just Pharaoh the god above him. He has the king's ring. He has the king's chariot. He has the king's power. This godly young man who trusted God, gave himself to love and serve his neighbour in the most degrading of conditions, is now elevated to a position of the greatest power in the world at that time. That is a most astounding change. To be an unknown nobody, persecuted and afflicted as a slave in a prison, and in the very same day you are elevated and you are put over a nation that was one of the superpowers. That's an amazing change. Brethren, here once again is temptation. This is one of the results. The results of this is actually a huge temptation for this young man who's aged 30 years. Why is this such a huge temptation? Well, just as much as abuse and poverty and injustice can be great temptations to sin, well, so can wealth and fame and power. And don't we see it in our day and age? How often are we reading about, this businessman and that businessman who's been found out and sent off to jail for how many years for defrauding people out of their money because they've come into positions where they can get lots of money and they have the power of others' finances? How often do we read of politicians who have been ruled in the system and using their power and their position to get what they want, and nowadays it becomes almost expected, yet another politician who's done what they all do. We know this is a very real temptation. Well, this man has just been handed the wealth of a nation. He can do anything he likes. He can make any decision he likes. He has all the power in the world, all the fame in the world, all the money in the world, and it's just laid on him. Go do as you will, Joseph. What temptation. As I was discussing with someone else just recently, he could even at this point in time go, oh right, where's that Potiphar in his wife? But he does not. What does Joseph do? Verse 46, we read that he went out from the king and he went to work. Diligent, hard labour. Gave himself to serve and to work. That's what he did. Not kick back, say, oh boy, this is going to be great. Lie around on the couch in Egypt and get fans and grapes put in his mouth and say, oh, this is a lie. He went out from the presence of the king. He said, okay, previously I've been able to serve Potiphar in his household. Previously I've been able to serve in the prison. Now I can serve the whole land of Egypt. I can serve everyone. And I will do so with all of my heart. Brethren, what of us? Think about your own heart. If you were given the opportunity to do whatever you want, whatever you could think of, to do your heart's desire, what would you do with your time and money and your efforts? What would you do? What is your heart set on? Do we understand, like Joseph, that we actually have already received all the treasures of the kingdom of heaven in God, our Saviour? And therefore, that our real heart's desire is that we would seek further opportunities to love and serve God and to love and serve our neighbour. That's what's set before us. But the result of this work of God in Joseph's life is also seen in his family life. Notice that we're told that Pharaoh gave him a name in verse 45, most likely an Egyptian name, this one. He calls him Zaphnath-Paaneah, which you can kind of try and translate it in Hebrew, but it really doesn't work. It seems that it's a Coptic name. And it seems that it kind of means preserver of the age. It seems that it's just purely an Egyptian name that Pharaoh was giving to him. Notice it only occurs here, never hear it again. He's continued to call Joseph because that's who he is. And by that, the Holy Spirit is telling us Joseph continues to identify as Joseph under the law. Not only that, but Pharaoh gives him Asenath, who's the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. The priest of On is one of the sun gods. Alright, so this is a very high and elevated woman who is the daughter who's given to wife. Pharaoh is saying, let's bring you in, Joseph. Let's get you into the culture of Egypt. Let's assimilate you into all of the land of Egypt. And yet Joseph continues to be known as Joseph. And it means essentially God increases. God is his increase. And not only that, but we see that it's evident in his family life. He's now married to this woman. He's faithful to his wife. And the names that he gives to his two sons continue to evidence that he has his heart set upon the Lord. Manasseh means to cause to forget. And the idea of that, as he really tells us here in this chapter, is that God is wonderfully the one who fills him up so much with the blessings of the Lord that it takes away from the pain that he has experienced with his family and what has happened there, and all of the afflictions that he has suffered. That God is the one. Because he has his eyes set on God, it causes those other things to become so much less as compared to the beauty of his God. Ephraim means double fruitfulness. And this is reminding him that in all the affliction, the hardship that he's received from God, that God has made him to be more and more fruitful, to love him and to serve him. Joseph had his heart still set on loving and honouring God. This was the result for Joseph personally. But there's a further result here. There's more results. This is not just a result for Joseph, but of course for the whole land. As God has said in those dreams and revealed through the interpretation, these things truly do come to pass. The famine comes after the 7 years of amazing bounty. Joseph has gathered into the storehouses such that in the end he has to give up trying to count, because it's just impossible to count the amount of food that has been gathered in. God has really given great bounty to the land. But now comes the famine, and it's severe. Very soon Joseph needs to begin the process of selling the grain back to the people. Do we see that at this point, if God had not sent that revelation with this dream through Pharaoh, if Egypt did not have a Joseph who was there in all that wisdom to in fact gather in this grain, that Egypt would be devastated. This great and proud land, no food. No food, starving people, people that can't work, the nation dying, as it were, everything they can do to try and scrabble around it, with the crops dying, the animals dying, the people dying, the nation crumbling under these things. But not so. Instead, they have steady food and the means to sustain themselves in the midst of terrible hardship, because we learn that this famine is not just Egypt, this is all around the area. The whole of the Mediterranean area, and it seems going right up even in the area of Mesopotamia, because later on Jacob doesn't say to his sons, go up to Mesopotamia, where the family was, the extended family. Don't go up there. And it seems like that was affected by famine too. Don't go down to Egypt, because that's where they got food. This is a very widespread famine that's affecting so many places. But now, as Egypt then sells food to the other citizens, you see what happens. As Egypt says, okay, we'll sell food to the other nations, suddenly you can see that the other nations are now beholden to Egypt. It improves relationships with these other nations, because they can see Egypt has the ability to be generous to them. Not only that, but if they're coming to buy food in Egypt, what's happening? All the wealth of the other nations is being transferred from that wealth, from that nation, into Egypt. Egypt's coffers are growing and growing and growing at the expense of the other nations. God is making Egypt to become incredibly powerful and wealthy, even through what he has done here. That's part of the result. Why? Why? What's the reason? Why is God doing this? We are to certainly see God's mighty hand in personally caring for Joseph. God does that. He knows every one of his sheep. He deals with them personally in Christ Jesus. He causes Joseph personally to grow in grace even through affliction and trial. But, brethren, we are also to see here that God is caring for his church. God is caring for his church then, and God is caring for his church in all ages. God loves his people with a perfect and pure and powerful love. He does not ever fail to do good for them, even in the hardships, as we've been seeing. But we also ought to know this. There's an opposite side to that. If God knows those that are his and he loves them, God does not know and God does not love. In fact, God hates those who are not his. Remember Jesus? Apart from me, I never knew you. I never knew you. I never prayed for you. I never loved you. Okay? There's the two sides of the coin necessarily. So what we see here is that God, in fact, hates his enemies with a pure and perfect hatred, and his purpose is to destroy every single one of them, in fact, in eternal hell. So then, that includes the multitudes in Egypt. The multitudes in Egypt, that whole nation, there would have been some, certainly in the Old Testament, that were drawn in and even departed with Israel when they went later on. But the vast majority of them, they were not the Lord's. God did not love Egypt as a nation, as we see all these things here. What is God doing therefore? What God is doing here is he's caring for a small family in Canaan. That's what he's doing with everything that's happening in Egypt. Just a few souls. And he's using the outcome of a famine that's affecting the whole of the world in that place to bring about his perfect purposes for just those few souls that is his purpose to save. Amazing truth. Amazing. That family will not starve to death in this famine. They will be preserved by the grain that's being stored up in Egypt. God makes Egypt wealthy, but it's for the good of his church, not for Egypt. That's why we read in Isaiah 43, verses 3 and 4. For I am the Lord thy God, the Holy One of Israel, thy Saviour. I gave Egypt for your ransom, Ethiopia and Seba for thee. Since you were precious in my sight, you have been honourable, and I have loved you. Therefore I will give men for you and people for your life. That's what God is doing here. The whole of this nation of Egypt was turned upside down. Pharaoh given this incredible dream. The wise men flummoxed. A person brought out of prison made to be the leader of the nation. 7 years of abundant plenty and then 7 years of famine. And all of it was for this purpose, that God was going to bring his church down into Egypt. And there, by his mighty and powerful hand in this heathen place, that he has made rich and powerful by his amazing dealings, God would cause this family tribe, the patriarchal Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to grow into a mighty nation of more than 2 million people. Egypt was simply being used as the nurturing place for the church to grow her, ready to return back into the promised land, into Canaan. And then, when God is finished with Egypt, what happens with Egypt? When he is finished with them and the church goes forth to the promised land. She's left a smoking building. The 10 plagues descend upon her. Her nation is destroyed in the Red Sea. Her army is destroyed in the Red Sea. And Israel plunders Egypt, takes the riches, and takes them forth with her. The riches are for his church, not for Egypt. God is doing the same today. He's doing the same today. The whole of this wicked world continues to receive sunshine and rain, much wealth and prosperity, amazing technology in so many different ways. But this is not God's love for all men, or some kind of common grace, as is so often said. This is God using all nations as the ransom for his church. Even the afflictions that nations carry out against God's church, he's using for their growth, even in the midst of temptation and trial and persecution, just as he did with Joseph, just as he did with his nation of Israel. And they were there in the midst of Egypt, and then the following Pharaoh started to bring affliction against them, all for his good purposes of loving his church. Brethren, even more, let's take one more step backwards, okay, before we finish this morning, because there's one other thing to see here, and that's this. It's to see the whole of the beauty of God's word in God bringing forth his Saviour. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. When Israel, that's the Old Testament church, was a child in her immaturity, I loved my church. I called my son out of Egypt and delivered the church. But, brethren, that verse is then interpreted for us in Matthew 2, verse 15, when Joseph and Mary took Jesus down into Egypt at God's instruction, and we read there, and Jesus was there in Egypt until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. Jesus. What are we seeing here in Genesis 41 and what follows on from there? This is all part of the coming of Christ the Saviour. This is all part of God's wondrous work to bring forth Jesus Christ. The one in whom Joseph had his hope and his trust. We're actually to see Christ in the Old Testament church. Remember Revelation, as it says, there is the woman who's labouring to bring forth the man-child. Well, this is the church, and she's labouring, and she's going to bring forth the Christ who is coming. And this is all part of that labouring. We're to see Christ in the midst of the Old Testament church. But we're to see the church in Christ. Because when you compare Hosea with Matthew, he is the Son. He is the Son. Yes, the Son does refer to the church. More important, as Matthew tells us, the Son is Christ. We're to see Christ there. He is the Son whom God will call out of Egypt, call out of the midst of the wretchedness of this world. And as he calls his Son, he calls all those that are in him. Out of the death of this world, out of the idolatry, out of all of the death and slavery to sin. And he calls out his Son to himself and to life forevermore. Here, you see, we see the reflections of all the beauties of our salvation coming to pass. We don't see here so much of the direct types of Christ and his work, but it's a bit like a beautiful sparkling diamond. Everywhere you turn it, you keep seeing flashes of the beauty of what God is doing. Here is Joseph. What's he called? Preserver of the age. He's not Christ, in actual fact, the preserver of the age. Who alone is able to bring forth and declare the true word of God? Jesus Christ, our prophet, who speaks the truth, tells us that wonderful truth. Is it not Christ who brings forth out of his storehouses of grace life for us in the midst of the famine and the dearth of this world? Preserves and gives life to us, his people. Here you see is God saving his people through miraculous events. And right then at that time, here is the church up in Canaan, and they knew nothing at all about the wondrous works that God was doing powerfully and mightily down in Egypt. They end up receiving these things with open-mouthed astonishment, the same as we were not even in existence when Christ died on the cross 2,000 years ago. We receive it now with open-mouthed astonishment. Let's praise, let's worship our God who has been bringing forth our salvation in the elevation of Joseph, certainly, but really it's in the elevation and the glorious work of Christ our Redeemer, even many years ago from the nation of Israel. Amen. Let's stand and pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, we do thank you that here in the New Testament age we are able to look back into this wondrous history that you were working, being the one outside of time, and you set before us most wondrous things. We see your care of us individually and personally, and for us as church, we are blessed that we are indeed brought through this life in Christ Jesus, your Son, in whom we have all blessings. Strengthen our hearts this day by faith. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. Our final psalm is Psalm number 72.